Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I'm in a great mood today, and I think that's because of 4 reasons. One, just the flowers are popping, the weather is amazing, and I'm just loving being out in the garden. That always lifts my spirits. But Friday night, that's the second reason. Friday night, we did this recording that we've been talking about doing for a half a year. Asked Hillary Dickman from Colorado College to take notes as she read files this year about what stood out both ways, do's and don'ts when it came to the activity section. And it wasn't just Hillary and I, it was 4 of our 7 co-hosts. So Vince was there, Susan was there, Julia was there. And all 5 of us just had a very robust 90-minute conversation that we think is going to help a lot of students. And we're all admissions nerds, admissions geeks, because, we're here like past 10 o'clock on a Friday. We're like, this is so much fun. But yeah, we all love what we do. So it was a lot of fun for us. And I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. So look for that for the first 3 Thursdays in the month of May. And then I'm just excited about this episode. Some episodes you like more than others. You hope they land well with your listeners. But we've always gotten good feedback when we've kind of done the summaries of the year, trends, observations about schools. Got real good feedback with a conversation had with Vince a few weeks ago. So now Julia's up to the plate. She's at bat. And have the same conversation with Julia. We just do a panoramic view conversation of the year in admissions and any specific things that we noticed about schools. And I think we're really candid and transparent and just having a conversation. You guys get to be a fly on the wall. And then I loved editing Lisa's outstanding interview. It's a brand new interview that Lisa did with Elizabeth Hamlet. Now, Elizabeth Hamlet is an expert on disability services. And so she's going to be giving a number of tips and sage advice for how to transition successfully from high school to college, specifically if you have a student who is in need of disability services. It was robust, it was fun, it was engaging. I liked it a lot, and I think you guys are going to like it a lot. So you'll hear that over the next 3 weeks. But before we dive into the content, 2 announcements. Karen Christoph is 16 days away. Karen Christoph is an admissions pro with 35 years experience, 5 different institutions. She is smart, she is personable, she is engaging, and you're going to love it. And you get an hour to ask your questions to Karen. All you have to do is go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, go to the events tab, sign up for the Karen Christoph session on May 7th. That's 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, 6:30 Mountain, 7:30 Central. It'll be 1 hour sharp. We start right on time. We end right on time. When you sign up, you get a chance to put your questions in, and we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions that you submit as we possibly can. And I'm going to be doing a bonus just for people that come out. I'm going to make sure that you also get the videotape of the Andy Strickler session, which was outstanding as well. And so you show up for the Karen Christoph section, you're going to get a video of the Andy Strickler session. I know some people say, why don't you just send the video to everybody? Because we want a good audience to show up and feed off that energy. If people know they're just getting the video, they're likely to just get the video. So, but that'll be our prize if you sign up for that. And I am excited to announce that Lisa and Linda are going to be doing a session for us in June on handling parent anxiety with the college admission process. Now, they did this presentation at our regional conference. I got to see the reviews. I don't think I read a single review that was not 5-star. Very satisfied, very satisfied, very satisfied. It was stupendous. And so they're working on taking that content, which was targeted there for college counselors, and tweaking it to target it for parents. And so can't tell you what day it will be yet. Just know we got a commitment for them to do it in June. And as soon as we get that date on fixed, we'll get that up on our events page. Once again, yourcollegeboundkid.com events tab. Sign up there. But without any further ado, let's transition to my conversation with Julia, trends in admissions for the class of 2024. Friends, I'm here with Julia, and I know a lot of you wrote in. You really liked when Vince and I sort of did a little panoramic view on our observations from this year's class. Julia's always great to talk to. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mark. It's been a minute. It's good to hear you.
It has. Well, our regular listeners may or may not know this, but, Milton senior class has like 185, close to 200 kids, and they really collaborate well. So Julia gets to see a lot of decisions, and this is going all the way back before you were on the podcast when your old boss, Rod Skinner, was on. A lot of the students applied to about 70 or 75 schools.
Yeah, actually, it's about 160 unique schools.
Whoa, you're going up in the world.
Yeah.
I know you've said the southern schools are, there's a bunch of schools that never used to get applications. So that's some of that. So anyway, it's great. So Julia, I'm just going to let you start and take this where you want to go. I do want to share a few things as well. We had 2 listeners who wrote in that said they really liked that conversation, but we focused mostly on national universities, state flagships, and they're like, hey, what about the small liberal arts schools? So I didn't talk as much about that because typically we'll have 3 to 7 applications for those schools where, some schools, like a place like Michigan, gets like 30 from us. So I'm able to see a lot more decisions and speak a lot more with a lot more confidence at the larger universities. But I can share a few things about liberal arts, but you take it where you want to go.
Sure. I don't know if I have much exciting things to say about sort of small liberal arts colleges. For my students, they mostly acted the same, if not maybe pretty much very predictable, very much the same. I found that our students actually had a little more success that I'm used to actually at the uber selective mid-sized institutions. So the Ivy Leagues, the Dukes, the Northwesterns, and it feels awfully privileged to say that. So I was actually surprised in a good way that there was a little more generosity from some of the most unkind in the selectivity scale.
Well, this, you and I have this conversation every year, just privately, and I haven't really had it with you this year. So I'm curious to see how your notes compare to like Vince and mine. Like I found Northwestern, I was very pleased with our admits at Northwestern and Michigan. We had way more admits at Northwestern and Michigan than we normally have, but we have different experiences. The one thing Vince and I never said, but I know we both feel this way because we talked about it off air, we found Pomona was harder than normal. We both had a kid that we had sort of seen Pomona typically take that Pomona never took this year. They've always been really selective, but they've always really wanted to get kids from certain regions they don't get as many kids from geographically. And I've seen that really help them. But this year I really felt Pomona selectivity. Do you have a lot of activity with them?
Typical. We have one admit who's a really strong student and also a recruited athlete.
Sure.
And that's it.
Well, we should say something about that. So the small selective liberal arts schools, they are different in that the percentage of recruited athletes is such a higher percentage of their student body.
Right.
It's really, really a big deal when you look at especially the NESCAC conference, New England Small Athletically, it's a high percentage of the student body. And when you get to, when I was at Vanderbilt, for example, they said they have 90 slots that go to athletes. Now that doesn't mean that it might not be noted this kid could help, but it's not as much as you would think percentage wise, right? And so, yeah, that continues to be the path to get into some of those schools, the easiest path. Any thoughts? Anything else you want to say?
I that is very much our bread and butter. We have very strong applicants overall, but most of our students who are athletes are going to be recruited athletes at Division 3 schools, and almost always will be going to a small liberal arts college. I have a couple of exceptions. We have a few student athletes at University of Chicago, a few at Johns Hopkins, but by and large, the vast majority are going to NESCACs, and potentially maybe some of the Claremont colleges. So we are well aware. And in fact, some of my students actually from the NESCACs, the New England small liberal arts colleges, I'm not including Tufts in that because they are not a small liberal arts college, will sometimes be like, I don't want to get recruited there because there's so many Milton athletes there already. So we do, and that does put the pressure on the rest of, I should say this, Milton is overrepresented at every selective small liberal arts college. So even though obviously New England colleges get a huge representation of our students, like a Bowdoin or a Middlebury or a Hamilton, in New York, not New England, we still feel that demographic crunch absolutely at places like Pomona or Davidson, just because we're not in their area or don't have a lot of students that go to those places. We are still overrepresented in their pool.
You know what? Davidson felt tougher this year to me too.
I think so too. I wasn't shocked at all by their decisions, but I was sort of, I think some of them might have maybe more gone wait list in the past, or, and I'll be honest, I think where I saw perhaps the biggest squeeze on, or the differences perhaps in a little bit behavior, maybe harsher behavior, in terms of maybe the deny rather than the wait list, is at small liberal arts. I saw that with our BIPOC students, and I do think, as someone who read applications for a small liberal arts school, it was really difficult for schools to feel really safe legally in what they wanted to be able to do, and preserve that level of diversity, representation, whatever that might mean. But when you're thinking about admitting, 500 students, you have to look at every single one and be ready to defend. And so I think that I did see some harsher decisions for our BIPOC students at small liberal arts colleges.
You know what I find? I don't know if you have observed this, because I've been talking to a lot of admission professionals around the country about affirmative action. And one thing I've noticed is that the more selective and the more prestigious they are, the more they fear a lawsuit. Like, they know that they're a
Right.
target. They know they're a target, and they're the ones that Ed Bloom would love to go after. They know that. And so some of the ones that aren't quite as selective, to me, they don't sort of feel like, all eyes are on me and I have to tread really, really lightly. I don't know if you've noticed that, but that's just an observation I have.
I think absolutely yes. Because, for example, like, I loved me some of our Hobart Williams Smith and Dickinson, and these are still selective by
Sure.
the actual definition schools, but maybe less selective than a Pomona or a Swarthmore or Williams by a long shot. And I didn't see that kind of activity right at those places. I think you're right, Mark. I think the sort of, the hotter you are in the news, the more reason to hate you, the more reason you might get sued or looked at.
Another thing about the small liberal arts schools too is there's such a sense of bonding and community there.
Right.
That they are some of the ones I feel, and you have to speak individually, because obviously Amherst and Pona walked away from legacy admissions, but I think there's some of the ones where legacy matters more too. There's that community bond, and some of it is related to money too.
Oh, yes.
It absolutely is. Like, the two biggest sources of funding for schools are tuition and donations, right?
Yep.
And donations oftentimes, like alumni, are really a big part of that. And so I feel like that legacy bond, I don't see a lot of them willing to walk away from that, especially the ones that are really residential, which is a lot of their model. And if they're more remote, like we bond, we form this connection. And so that also makes it tough. Now, I've noticed Middlebury seems to be getting tough too. I mean, I know it's been tough for a while, but I certainly have seen this. Some of the observations I'm giving are not necessarily all just all this year. Some of them are sort of trend line I've seen over a few years. Now, one thing that's this is an interesting conversation I can have with you. What are schools that when you see who they admit, it feels different than their admit rate? Because I have some on my list. So, for example, like Bates and Colby, they present as single digit admit rates in regular decision.
Right.
But I definitely see those schools take kids that you wouldn't think a single digit admit school would take in early decision in regular. And Northeastern, I see Northeastern gobble up full pay families. Like, they might send
Yes.
you to Mills out in California or send you overseas, but they're not the 5 to 6% admit rate selectivity in terms of who I see get admitted there. And any thoughts on that?
Completely agree. Definitely on Northeastern. Bates, I think we at Milton, I definitely see they're really tough, but that makes sense. We have an overrepresentation there. Colby does the Chicago thing where it
Sure.
admits hundreds of people off their wait list. And so to me, the students they might admit from us in regular decision are definitely standard strong students. So they are really strong students, but you're right, by the numbers, they should be getting the same results at Colby that they're getting at Princeton and Harvard, right? So I definitely see the students that didn't get those Ivy Leagues will get Colby, for example. But I'm still perplexed by Northeastern. Especially this year, they took I was actually shocked at some of the students they took, and they all had being full pay in common.
Yeah, they're clearly need aware. So they made a decision a while ago to say they met 100% of need. And sometimes when a school maybe doesn't have the highest endowment per student, and all of a sudden they say that they're meeting 100% of need, I'm very suspect because I know, like, what are you doing to get there? Are you counting all of home equity in your equation? Or are you so need aware, need conscious that you're just identifying those full pays to do it? And if you're an amazing kid and you're needy, like it's a completely different standard. I'm not in that office, but this is what I see. I saw multiple kids this year that didn't get in, like Florida and Florida State in-state.
Oh, yeah.
And they get in Northeastern, but yet they're talking about 5-6% admit rate, and they're all full pay.
Yeah. So also we at Milton, we have probably close to half the class applies because there are no, and here's the other thing about Colby, friends, if you don't know, it's a free application and no supplement. So I have students who have no interest in Colby applying to them. Northeastern, at least there's usually a little bit of a nod of I've looked into you. I'm going to pay for the app fee. I would say close to half of my students who apply, if not more, get some kind of in to Northeastern. So they are an admit, whether that's to a different campus, NUN, whatever it is. But that, to me, there shouldn't be, we are a lovely school, but we're not that kind of school. Like, we should not have over 25 students getting into Northeastern if their admit rate really is that low.
Well, and our listeners may not know this, but they do something which to me is a little gimmicky. When they present their early action admit rate, they present the Boston statistics, and they don't count the Mills College or the overseas option. They don't count those, the one semester or the full year abroad.
So 3 out of their 4 ways you get admitted, they don't count in those.
They don't count those because they've set that up that's a transfer pathway. And so it's a really gimmicky thing to look more selective than you are.
I can't.
I know Julia doesn't. But the bad thing about these gimmicks is that they can work.
That's why I'm really mad. I have a bunch of students, and I'm sorry, I'm getting a little heated here. I have a
Oh,
bunch of students.
you should see Julia's
Yes.
facial expressions.
I have students that actually can't afford to go there that are going because they got into a sub 10% admit rate school. They didn't even know it's maybe a 5-year program.
Yeah.
I don't think it's right. I think it's really unethical. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah. No, I hear you.
yeah, because of course they're teenage brains. Of course, I would probably be the same way. If you told me I got into a school that has a similar selectivity rate to the Ivy Leagues, I would feel weird saying no to that school.
Which is one of the reasons why schools do what they do in terms of, like, demonstrated interest and high ED rates and waitlisting people they think won't come. Julia and I were talking off air. Why don't you talk about, Julia, something you saw an increased trend in about early wait lists and what that usually means and what that signals, so people may not understand that. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so Mark and I were talking specifically about these small liberal arts schools, right? And so obviously we've got a couple weird things this year in the admission cycle between and probably the weirdest thing that I think is affecting wait lists is the FAFSA debacles, right? Plural. And so traditionally, even in sort of unprecedented times, I'm thinking of like COVID, for example, most schools, especially when they're selective, will indeed wait until after May 1 to even look at their wait list. Certainly they have special people running numbers. They can probably predict like, oh, we might really much go to the wait list. But even then, a college is very rare, especially small liberal arts. We are talking about no way out for over enrollment at a small liberal arts college, right? You don't have, you might be able to get some trailers, but these colleges are often not in a major urban setting where they could, something like a Northeastern, where they can they could rent out the Sheridan as one of their dorms. Also, too, you don't have housing is pretty tight. It fits just the amount of people that they plan to admit. So going to the wait list before you know exactly who is in your class is very rare at a small liberal arts school, let alone most universities and colleges, right? What I am seeing this year from small liberal arts is there are a handful, a few, if you will, very selective ones that we just talked about that have already gone to the wait list before mid-April. So they have still 2 weeks, half the month left to figure out who is coming, but they already know they have space for some of those students. Now, some of those students have been admitted to if the school has a spring start. So there's a handful of small liberal arts that do offer a spring start. And I have seen the greatest amount of waitlist activity happen there for the spring start. But I thought I was reading things wrong when I heard about this because I've never seen a school that we're talking about an enrollment of like after they've admitted half their class in early decision, right? So half the class is already spoken for. That gives them maybe, I don't know, 300 spots at the most, maybe 200, maybe 100 spots. And they already know in mid-April that they're not going to get anywhere near that. Sort of says something to me, right? Like,
so there's a whole term for this. We call it ED3. And it's ED3 in the sense that if there's someone you want, but you don't want to admit them because you think they're not going to come and therefore they're going to drive your admit rate up and hurt your brand, then you waitlist them and make them prove to you that they want to come. And they actually don't really show up in your numbers because you put feelers out to see if they're interested. And if they're not, then they don't really actually count as someone who you admitted and you whiffed on them.
right.
And so that's been going on for a while. I mean, Chicago's been doing this for a long time. How long? 10 years? 8 years? It's been a while.
Yes. I'll say this, though, for every other, I don't know any other wait list that works like that. And for the 3 small liberal arts colleges I'm talking about, none of these students even wrote a wait list letter yet.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't even communicate with the college.
Before they did that. Yeah.
So the college is just like, you were on the wait list, you accepted it. So in fact, these students didn't accept the wait list spot.
So what's your take on what's going on?
I think it's financial, and I think some of these schools I'm talking about are ones you just mentioned, Mark, that were a little harder than usual. So I think between financial troubles with the FAFSA and students maybe dropping out or not being able to complete, or having the CSS profile already and knowing what the student's package is, because most of these small liberal arts colleges do use the CSS profile in addition to the FAFSA, that they just know already that either financially it's not going to work for those remaining people deciding, and or maybe they really were very harsh in their regular decision admitting and have now realized they've got an awful lot of room. The numbers are not trending in an upward way.
Yeah, who are the schools, Julia, that you see are just they just kind of admit kids if they're admissible without a lot of the gimmickry? I know Connecticut College is pretty good. You and I had talked about that before. You usually get your kids admitted there. But who else is sort of on that list?
So I get this is the privilege, I think, of going to an independent school. Every college except U Chicago, I have plenty of students who never follow up, or even if they do, it made no difference, that will just go to our students on the wait list because they were really strong students, and likely there was a demographic reason as to why they weren't admitted. Maybe they didn't, they have too many boys, they have too many girls, they have too many girls from my school, things like that. So we're actually pretty, besides like Chicago and then Case Western, we don't really need to do anything for our students to maybe come off the wait list.
What do one thing I noticed this year, and this was bizarre. Miami was much harder to get into for most of the parts of the country. But
Yeah.
then for the Miami area, they were like Northeastern. They were admitting, like, once again, kids not getting in Florida State, we're getting in Miami,
Yeah.
from South Florida. So I don't know. Did you notice anything with them? And I don't know if you have a lot of applications
They're
there.
Tulane to us now. That's how I say it to students. So I don't have any current students that are from Florida. So I didn't have any backyard kids for them.
Okay.
So, but we didn't get a single admit to Miami. I can tell you that at Milton Academy.
Yeah, I think we had two outside of Florida, Georgia. And then Florida, like it's especially South Florida, they take a pretty broad range. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. I don't know if that's, sometimes schools have a commitment to their backyard.
Yes, that's what I'm hoping is what's going on
Like,
there.
a lot of schools do that, right? Like Chicago has a commitment, Penn has a
Totally.
commitment. Some of the Boston schools have a commitment to their backyard. But that was one thing I noticed with them. What trends have you seen? Maybe not just this year, but over the last few years with Villanova. Anything?
Oh, good luck, everybody. So we've had, I'll say this, it's pretty predictable, but I think what really bums my families out, and I don't know if you feel the same way, Mark, is that their selectivity and perceived prestige does not at all match the results for my students.
Oh, that is so frustrating because you have a school when you're building a listing, you think this could be a great school.
Yes.
But maybe it's a stretch school, and the family's like, oh, I don't think that school's not good enough for me. And I'm like, you might not get in.
Yes, right? Yes.
Richmond is the same way, by the way. Richmond is the exact same way.
Yes. Yeah. So actually Villanova to us is one of the more difficult schools to get into. So if you, and then I think, so for me, it is like the only time I've seen someone admitted in early action. We've rarely had a regular decision admit, in the last, I'd say basically since they got into the Sweet 16, for basketball.
Well, they have 2 national championships in 5 years, so it's more than the Sweet 16.
Yep. So if you are going for business, forget it. Some of my students have gotten into Wharton and not Villanova Fox School of Business. And then also we have a really hard time with engineers, and then also lab sciences and life sciences.
Nursing is tough.
Yeah. Oh, we are lucky. I get a nursing student once like every 5 years. It is a lot of our students are not seeking sort of pre-professional tracks just yet. But I even had, I would say, a standard strong student apply in early action for like peace and justice studies, and she had to come off the wait list, and she's
Yeah, no, I found like stuff like IR, like that kind of stuff was tougher this year there, although you just never know. I was happy with a kid that got in for business, but they've definitely got a lot harder.
yeah.
Anyone that did, have you noticed George Washington taking a broad range? Because to me, they've really not only taking a broad range, but throwing presidential scholarships at tons of kids.
We've always been lucky. Actually, GW is one of our most popular schools at Milton. We had, in the class of 2022, we had over 10 students go to matriculate at GW,
Oh,
which
wow,
is great.
that's a lot.
Yeah, so they're very, obviously there's a couple majors that are a little tougher than others, but I think they read our students really well. So I would say about half our most of our students get good news. About half of those students will get merit-based scholarships. And then I have a lot of students that are there even without merit-based scholarships. And they have actually come through, not for all of my financial needs students, but they've surprised me sometimes with their generous packages for some of our financial needs students. So they're pretty, I'm just like too afraid to talk because at this point, they're such an awesome school for my students. And I just worry that they're going to be like NYU, USC next year. So I'm like worried I'm like putting it out in the ether and it will happen. I don't know.
You know, one thing that's crazy, and I think this would really surprise people, is how all over the place aid offers can be.
Oh gosh, I know.
Like I had a student accepted to 5 of the most competitive schools in the country. One of them said, and they're all $90,000 privates. Most of them the Ivy League, some outside. One of them said you don't qualify for any.
Mm-hmm.
3 of them came in asking for 30. And three of them gave 30,000 in need-based aid, because these are all schools that don't give merit, by the way.
Right, yeah.
So 3 gave 30,000, 1 came in at 0, 1 gave 8,000, and 1 gave 60,000.
What?
So,
yes.
Yes.
Oh my
So
gosh, like make it make sense.
Yeah, so the range was from you don't qualify to you get 60,000 in need-based aid.
Wow.
Isn't that insane?
It is insane.
And I just share that for people who are, like that stuff happens.
It does.
Friends, when editing this podcast, there are a few things that I didn't say that I wanted to say. So as the editor, I get a chance to get some inserts in. One thing I wanted to say is for these type of schools, these small liberal arts colleges, continue to see demonstrated engagement, also known as demonstrated interest, to play a larger role than I see for the national universities. And I see that trend only continuing as students apply to more schools. Secondly, while I made the statement that being a recruited athlete continues to be the easiest path into these schools, and I also made the statement that legacy seems to continue to be a factor, and I don't see it going anywhere, where I really want to emphasize you need to be really strong as an athlete at these selective small liberal arts schools. And you need to be really strong as a legacy too. So I don't want to make it sound like you can just be an average mediocre student. And if you're an athlete or a legacy, then the door is wide open. It's just not how it works. So I really wanted to add those points. Oh, and there's one other school that I wanted to comment on. And it was in my notes and I just missed it when I was talking with Julia. And that is Williams College. That continues to be just a very, very difficult admit. When we were talking about schools where you look at the percentage of kids that get in and you think, it doesn't feel right with what you see, Julia and I focused a lot on schools where the admit rate looks lower than what you experience. Well, I actually feel the admit rate looks higher when I look at Williams's regular decision admit rate versus who I actually see get in. Just not that many spots by the time you take away the hooked applicants. So Williams College continues for me, and I think many others, to be an extremely difficult admit in regular decision. Hope this helps. Well, Julie, I could talk to you about this stuff all day. There's so much more we can say, but we've got to get to Lisa's interview with Elizabeth Hamlet. And I've noticed that these Monday sessions have been inching longer and longer and longer. Hour 10, hour 15, hour 20. I want to get back to 40 to 60 minutes for Thursdays and 90 to 120 on Thursday. So let's transition.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part one of Lisa's interview with Elizabeth Hamlet on pathways for success for students with disabilities, Liz shares her backstory from special ed teacher to author and success advocate for students with learning disabilities. Liz talks about the range of disability accommodations that colleges provide, and she talks about how those accommodations differ from the high school accommodations. Liz talks about what colleges are legally bound to provide versus what is optional or what services they can charge for. Liz talks about what a student needs to do to keep their accommodations. Liz tells us how much do students need to advocate for themselves. And finally, Liz talks about how FERPA impacts parent communication once a student heads to college. Listen and enjoy.
Hi, this is Lisa. I am one of the co-hosts of Your College Bound Kid, and today I'm very excited to be talking to Elizabeth Hamlet, who is a college learning consultant, a professional speaker, and a freelance writer on the topics of disability in higher education. And if that weren't enough, she's also the author of the book, 7 Steps to College Success, A Pathway for Students with Disabilities. Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I always like to ask our guests about how they got to the position that they are at now. So tell me about your path and how you became a college learning consultant.
I would be happy to. How much time do you have?
Well, if you've listened to Your College Bound Kid, you know we have all the time in the world. Those episodes go very, very long. So take us around the barn the long way.
Well, to get to the more direct way, I had been a special ed teacher in the mid-90s and, had a first job out of graduate school, left that one. And then started in a part-time job at a high school, and to supplement my income, I started a part-time job at the college where I had just finished graduate school in their disability services office. And it was in the course of doing that work that I learned all the stuff that they had not taught me just being in their program there about how things worked at college. And, here I was, a high school special ed teacher with none of this information, before I started this job about what my students could and couldn't expect when they got to college. So my husband took a new job. We moved somewhere else, and I had a part-time job with the state university, then just reviewing documentation as part of a committee. So for those just new to this, when students register for accommodations at college, they often have to provide paperwork that shows that they have a disability, and we call that documentation. And then in the course of reviewing students' requests, I was looking at the requests for things that I knew that we didn't do that students didn't know. And so when I left that job, I got interested in trying to fill this information gap that, unfortunately persists now 15 years later. So I started writing and I started doing presentations, and, that led into the first edition of my book. We're now on the 3rd edition. And, I continue to try to communicate with people about, these changes so that everybody knows how to prepare students for it.
Yeah, no, it's really important. And I think you've alluded to this already, but understanding how accommodations differ from the high school setting to the college setting is huge in preparing students to go off to college. Can you tell us more about some of the differences between the two?
Sure. And I do want to start because again, people are often in very different places with their knowledge of all of this stuff, their contact with it. So for anybody who's hearing this for the first time, colleges do provide accommodations. So let's be really clear. There are disability accommodations, and, you would hope that would be obvious, but I've talked to some people who've been misinformed. So there are accommodations, and they are for all kinds of disabilities. So you don't have what we now call an apparent disability that somebody can observe to be accommodated. We also, physical, sensory, mental health, attention, learning disabilities, autism. We cover everything. So what changes, though, is a combination sort of the expectations for any college student. And, in some places, there are just things we don't have to provide because of exceptions that the laws specifically in place mention. So when I say that they're just, things that we expect students to do. So, for instance, sometimes in high school, students have an IEP that says the teachers are going to send them the assignments, every time something is assigned, the homework. And that's just not something we do at the college level, and I need to stop for a moment and just say this. So this is not legal or medical advice. I am neither a doctor nor a lawyer. So I'm always very careful to say that because, the truth is there are more than 4,000 colleges in the country. And I would be pretty foolish if I said I knew what was happening everywhere. I try to give people sort of a sense of the field and some of the things that come up in our professional community, with people asking questions or looking for advice. So that kind of thing is not something we do. Generally, professors don't have to provide students with a study guide, even though high school teachers may have done that for students. We expect students to figure out how to study for their exams in college. So those are kind of the first shifts of, expectations that we have for students. And then I mentioned the exceptions, and there are 4 written into the laws. So we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and specifically Subpart E. So 504 provides most of the guidance for this because it was written first and kind of covered everything. And then the ADA was written 17 years later to kind of bolster the, protections for individuals with disabilities. But of the 4, there are 2 that I think are really relevant. So the first is that we don't have to do anything that means providing a personal service or device. So when we talk about services, the only one that the law mentions is readers for personal study. But the way it's probably easier to understand things is, for instance, disability services offices don't have to provide any kind of specialized tutoring or specialized support appointments for students with disabilities. So every place that I have worked, students have come in and they've said, I need to meet with a learning disability specialist. Colleges don't have to do that. And if they do, they can charge for them. And some of your listeners may be familiar with the few dozen or so fee-based programs that various colleges have. They are allowed to charge for those because of those services fall under, sort of the range of things that we don't have to do. And even when a college, let's say, provides tutoring for all students through the, campus tutoring center, students with disabilities are not entitled to more sessions than their neurotypical peers get. Or if the arrangements are 5 students to 1 tutor, they're not entitled to one-on-one tutoring. So things like that, which again, maybe, depending on where students have gone to high school and what their experiences have been, may be really different. And then the other one, and it has wide-ranging implications, is that we don't have to do anything that fundamentally alters our programs. So that starts with admission and it ends with graduation. So if Hamlet University says you have to have, a 4.5 weighted GPA and have been the captain of the, a state athletic team and first chair in some section of the state band, those are my requirements. And I don't have to make any exceptions for students with disabilities. Once you get into my college, I might have what are called general education or core requirements, where on top of whatever classes you take for your major, you also have to take, let's say, 2 courses in social studies and 2 in sciences and 2 in humanities. I don't have to make substitutions for those. I always have to review requests. We can't prevent students from asking for this thing, and we review these requests all the time. But we don't have to decide that they can have a substitution if the university has gone through a process where they have reviewed, brought together some kind of collection of department heads, perhaps, and administrators. The laws don't even talk about what this process would look like. And actually, the laws don't even talk about this process. This is just sort of coming out of decisions that have been made over the years. So we can decide that, all those courses are fundamental to our programs and not say yes to a substitution. And then within students' majors, there are things that they're going to have to do. Currently, there's a discussion in my community about art students having to sit through critiques of their art. That's a pretty typical requirement in an art program. And there's some discussion of how the experience could be accommodated for that student. But that student's, I think, very unlikely to not have to be present for and participate in critiques.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that schools don't have to change the content of their requirements at all. And they don't have to change them either in their admissions requirements or once you get to the school. They might consider it.
Correct.
But they don't have to do it. And also that they don't have to provide anything like tutors or help or anything like that they might choose to do it, but that they don't provide to do that. Whereas in high schools, they're kind of legally required to do some of these things.
Right. So, again, we do provide accommodations, but I'm just trying to make a distinction between things like extended time for exams or permission to record your lectures and the kinds of, more intensive support appointments mostly that students might be accustomed to from high school. And, listen, one of the things I try to make sure people know is if a high school waives its own requirements for graduation by telling a student they don't have to take a particular class, they can do whatever they like. But again, that doesn't mean the college, is required to admit them. And it also doesn't carry over to us. We don't have to abide by somebody else's decision to make a substitution.
Right. So once a student does enroll in a college, how can they successfully obtain and then keep their accommodations? I have a feeling that process is quite different as well.
Yeah. Keeping them, the good news is keeping them is not hard. And frankly, getting them is not really a challenging process. And, my joke, and it's a particularly bad one this year, and I apologize. I usually say if you've ever filled out FAFSA, registering for disability accommodations is a cakewalk, but it's a very bad year for FAFSA. So I need a new joke. I apologize. Right. So students should be able to find this process online at the college. Just go into the search feature on the school's website, and they should be able to navigate to it. So generally, it's a pretty simple process. They fill out a form because, this is college and nothing happens if you don't fill out a form. And that's mostly like adult life too. I think it's good preparation. And then they provide documentation of their disability. At some schools, they'll have to have what might be called an intake appointment, names vary, where they meet with disability services and, DS, as we'll call them moving forward, might just have some follow-up questions, just want to get to know them a little bit. It's not like a job interview or even a college admission interview where students have to worry that if they don't say the right thing, they won't get something or they won't be, or they won't get anything at all. It's just an opportunity to talk. And parents and professionals need to be aware that when students register with us, that form that they fill out is going to ask them things like, what is your disability? What accommodations are you seeking? Why do you need them? And so I was just involved with some kind of conversation, I think last week, about being straightforward with students about their disability and not couching it in language intended very well and nicely to, preserve their feelings But there is some danger in not letting students have that self-awareness that they have been identified with a disability and what's in it, because we're going to ask them. And look, parents can be there being helpful to them while they fill out our form, but be aware that that kind of knowledge is going to be important to them. So, for instance, if they know that they don't, that they have a weak working memory, then probably they're going to ask for accommodations for note taking. And while they're in class, they should probably try to take some notes, but recognize that because they're having trouble doing all those things simultaneously, they're probably going to need to review their notes afterward in a more significant way than perhaps their neurotypical peers might.
Right. How much do students need to advocate for themselves? Like in high school, right? The parents can talk to anybody. The high school might not enjoy it, but it's generally not super frowned upon. But in college, like if I were to go call up my daughter's college and start talking to them, they'd have some issues with that. So how do parents function in that environment? How do students function?
Yeah, so I know it can be a hard transition for parents, so it's a good idea for them to start, making sure in high school that students are in on their meetings and that, they get accustomed to, for instance, picking one class a year to communicate with the teacher about their accommodations. So the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, also called FERPA, is the one that we sort of live our lives by here in college. So parents of 18-year-olds already know that once your student turns 18, the high school is going to say to the student, okay, you're in charge now. Here's a form if you want us to communicate with your parents. Well, at college, the one thing we're willing to send parents without a release is the bill.
Yeah,
if they are paying the tuition.
I always get the bill.
Isn't that interesting how we can get that bill to you without your student's permission, sometimes with their blessing, right? But nothing else. So the grades are not going to arrive home. I guess I'm so old. Oh my gosh, I just really outed myself. Yeah, because when I was in college, grades got mailed.
Right. They were mailed. Your parents got to the mailbox.
We did not have
first.
the internet.
Yeah. Then you were hosed potentially. So
old habits die hard. I apologize. So yeah, there's not going to be an email sent, CCing parents when grades go up. And so, parents upon hearing how their student registers with our office may think, well, but Elizabeth, not so sure my student's going to come to you. So can I fill out that form? It is not technically illegal for family, for parents or another loved one to do this for a student unless, and it's not illegal, but it may violate a school's tech code if a student gives anybody else their login information. And that is a thing to avoid. So generally, if you called our office and said, my daughter Elizabeth is probably not going to show up, can I do this registration for her? We're going to say no. And so then some parents are going to say, but I have power of attorney, or, oh, I have guardianship. I started by saying, I am not a lawyer. So my understanding is, and again, this is as a learning specialist, not a qualified professional in other ways, that power of attorney is probably insufficient. And guardianship rules vary from state to state. And so all I can do is encourage people to contact those offices and see what the rules say. If their student has been admitted to school and chosen one at the time that they hear this, or even if they're just looking at schools, parents can call the disability services offices and say, if my daughter comes to Hamlet University, could I do this form for her? And they'll get an answer. So yeah, and the thing is, I mean, look, we know that students who do well have parents who are supportive. So it can be hard to find that line between supportive and doing too much. And I get that. So, but think about it from our point of view. If you fill out our form and your student is not involved at all, we're going to go through a process. We're going to read their reports. We're going to make a decision. And then, the way that this gets communicated back to the student Usually it's by email, it may be by phone call, it all depends. But if your student's not involved, why would we even do this? Because we're going to go through this process, and if we've never even talked to them, what makes you think they're going to use those accommodations?
Friends, this concludes the first part of Lisa's 3-part interview with Liz Hamlet on how students can successfully transition to college if they have disabilities. I hope you'll join us next week for part 2 of 3. On Thursday's episode, Vince will continue his panoramic view of the University of California as he'll go through all 9 schools and give us insights in each of the 9 schools. Julia and I will answer a SpeakPipe question from a listener, and Lisa will continue her interview with Jeremy Lowe, the VP of Enrollment at American University. And that will be part 2 of 2. And then I will continue with my interview with Chris Cage, the VP of Enrollment at Belmont University, on understanding Belmont University. And this is part 2 of 3. Friends, there's not a lot of time left to make a decision. Some of you have already selected your school and made your decision. For those who haven't, many schools have stuck with their May 1st deadline despite the FAFSA debacle. Others have moved it to May 15th and a couple June 1s. But either way, the decision is imminent. What I want to encourage you to do as a student is to not focus on impressing or pleasing your peers. And I want to challenge parents with the same thing. Don't be focused on trying to impress your peer group. Instead, as a student, you should be looking for a place that you will be happy at, that will feel like home, because if you're happy, you'll do better work and you'll have a better experience. And who wants to be unhappy for 4 years? But not only where you'll be happy, this place should be like a trampoline that will catapult you to opportunities. Now, sometimes that trampoline catapulting to opportunities is difficult because it can involve being stretched in ways that are uncomfortable, but they will prepare you for your future. So if you can think about 2 things, think of it as a coin. Happiness, comfort level, home away from home, yes, but preparation for life after college. And the last thing is trust your instincts, trust your instincts, trust your instincts. And remember that college is a match to be made, not a prize to be won. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.